I think we've all been stressed out from time to time, maybe especially more this year, for various reasons. Goes without saying, I guess. I know that anxiety can come from particular triggers or situations or locations or people. Sometimes anxiety just shows up. You don't know why. I've never really dealt with panic attacks, but I know some here that have really struggled with that. And one of the things that I've seen as far as a treatment for that is it's something, it goes by some different names, but essentially it's called something like the grounding method. The 5-4-3-2-1 or some other numbers, 3-3-3 grounding method. And all that means is this. And I have it written down here because I can't remember this. So if you're having a panic attack, they tell you to, like in your mind, to identify 5 things that you can see. It doesn't really matter what they are. You just identify 5 things. 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you could taste. And, you know, if you're in this room, I don't know what you're going to think about tasting. But maybe the wall tastes like cardboard. I don't know. But what's the point? To ground yourself. It's a grounding method. In other words, you're taking the time for mental focus on particular things that are really inconsequential. They're inanimate objects. And you're taking your mind and taking the focus off of whatever the anxiety is, whatever has triggered the panic attack, even if it hasn't been triggered by something particular, it just shows up. It takes your mind off of the fact that you are panicking because you're focusing on something else. This is very similar to a spiritual discipline. The month of November is usually aligned with the idea of Thanksgiving. I began to do a little bit of study into a few characters of the Bible. I want to look at one in particular today, and for the rest of the month, depending on what my study churns up, I want to look at some others and kind of dedicate the rest of the month to the idea of gratitude. Because essentially gratitude is this. Look, I can have gratitude for the fact that I had coffee this morning. I can have gratitude that I'm wearing clothes, that I have the use of my legs, that I can speak. I have gratitude for those things. And typically the most miserable people that you'll ever meet are people who do not really exercise gratitude. But more importantly, maybe one morning I won't have any coffee. Or maybe I'm in an accident and I can't use my legs. Or maybe something happens and I can't use my voice. You see, gratitude is not just about the superficial. It isn't about just the things that are here one day and gone another day. Those are important. A proper attitude of understanding that every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father. We understand that. But gratitude needs to be more about the unchanging things, or the unchangeable things, or the immutable things. I like that word. Things that cannot possibly be changed because you're a Christian. Now, while those who don't have gratitude about the fact that they actually have a job or a car or a family or something like that and are miserable, that's one thing. But when someone doesn't have gratitude about the unchangeable things, they're not just miserable. Those are people who are losing spiritual battles. I can start to list off for you battles personal to myself, just that I've gone through this year. that don't have anything to do with politics or pandemic or anything like that. Just things that are stressful. You have your own list of things. And all of those things are Satan's tools to drown you in whatever those things are of doubt, anxiety, being mistreated, things like that that can overwhelm you, overcome you. And unless we are focused in on and actually are mindful and have gratitude of the unchanging and even unchangeable things, then we will lose those spiritual battles. I want us to think of gratitude in the sense of fighting spiritual warfare. We oftentimes don't think of it that way, but it really is. It's not just about be thankful for the shoes that you have on your feet. It's much more in depth than that. It's much more powerful than that. In fact, it parallels closely to, when you think of the idea of gratitude, it parallels closely to the equipping that you find in Ephesians 6:10 through 18, putting on the armor of God. Not that all of those are the same thing as having gratitude, but it's the idea that we are in a spiritual fight. And because we're in a spiritual fight, we need to equip ourselves and we need to have spiritual, you might say, defensive tactics. You know, I haven't really practiced or trained in any defensive tactics. Typically, I feel like I can handle myself if I get attacked by somebody. I try to work out. I'm kind of, not a small guy. But, Alistair is a black belt, and sometimes I act like I'm going to punch him, and I regret it because then he his reflexes kick in, and he turns into a cat, and his arm hits my arm, and I feel like he broke my arm, and then he doesn't even know he did it because he's just a finely tuned fighting killer machine over there, right? And I haven't really trained in that. We're in a more important battle or fight. We're fighting a spiritual battle every day. And when we can understand that battle in terms of being prepared to defend against what Satan is trying to do to us, then we'll win those battles. And gratitude is a defensive tactic. I want you to think of it in that way. It is a defensive tactic. And the reason that I say that is because of what I've looked at and what I've studied about particular people in Scripture who Satan was going after relentlessly. It wasn't that they said, well, thank you for the house that I live in, because some of them didn't have a house. Thanks for my family. Some of them, their family was killed. Thanks for my friends. Some of them didn't have any friends. And they had to retreat. This is the way you think of it. They had to retreat into or take refuge into the unchanging spiritual things. And when you have that spiritual defensive tactic, then you can win a lot of battles against Satan. Gratitude, when I think of this taking refuge, it's something that can happen, that you can do when every temporary thing that you have disappears. It still wins the battle when you've lost everything. This defensive tactic will still win the battle. And really, when you think about this idea, maybe your mind has already gone to the song, Count Your Many Blessings, that sort of an idea. When you begin to do that, essentially what you begin to do is articulate a prayer to God of thanksgiving. When you are enacting the defensive tactic of gratitude, it manifests itself really in worship. We wonder why we shouldn't. We wonder why worship is something that we do and is so important. Why is it so important for us to gather together and worship together? Why is it so important for us to worship on our own? Why is it so important for us to worship within our families? Because part of worship is enacting this defensive tactic. Because when we enact this, when we exercise this, we essentially are worshiping God, and in that way we are taking retreat from the difficulties that we're experiencing, the anxieties, even panic attacks, and we are retreating into a place where we can win those battles. But it really isn't us that wins those battles. It's God that wins those battles. But we can't win those battles without this kind of worship. That's what gratitude is. We find this in Job. Chapter 1, what happens? He loses all of his belongings and his family except for his wife and his health. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2, he loses his health and his wife says, curse God and die. But we find in Job 1:20, the author records this. Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. What happened when he was knocked to the ground? Figuratively. He fell to the ground literally in worship. And of course, we know the line. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked shall I return. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And it's recorded that in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. And perhaps I'll do a study of Job, but I just wanted to mention that with Job, the first thing that he when tragedy happened, when Satan is literally in the background of this story, pulling the strings, that he's able to overcome this spiritual battle by worshiping God, by acknowledging the things in his life that are unchanging or unchangeable. But the person I want to look at is David. I want to look at this as quickly as possible. There's a handful of places that we find David. Look, let's be honest. There's a lot that's written about David. You can read and read and read. It follows him from when he's young to when he's comes to his deathbed, and he has written a lot of the book of Psalms. But in particular, what I want to look at are some events that happen within the story or the narrative of 1 and 2 Samuel, and then connect those to some psalms that he wrote during those events. Because when we look at this particular case study, if you will, of David, what we find is that when Satan is attacking him, he is very spiritually mature in that he knows how to exercise this defensive tactic of acknowledging the unchanging things, of exercising gratitude. The first one that we find that I'm going to look at, and I'm going to try to go in chronological order a little bit. But in 1 Samuel 19, Saul is out to get him. And Saul sends in 1 Samuel 19:11, Saul sends some people to his house to watch him, and they're going to kill him Saul's going to kill him in the morning. And his wife, Michal, tells him, if you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. And he escapes out the window. Now, during this event, or at this occasion, David writes Psalm 59. Of course, he's writing by inspiration. But he writes Psalm 59, and that the Psalms typically have some kind of a heading. Sometimes it talks about who it's written to or with, and even according to what kind of tune, I guess, the song would be, and the occasion. The heading for Psalm 59 says, to the chief musicians set to, this I guess is like the tune of the song is, do not destroy. Isn't that interesting? It sounds like a death metal band song or something, do not destroy. But that's the idea, that he is seeking not to be destroyed. And there is actually, I guess, some sort of a tune or a chant rhythm to that. I don't know exactly. But it says that it's a mention of David when Saul sent men and they watched the house in order to kill him. Let's look at just a few verses. And as we look at these verses, we're going to look at about 4 or 5 passages very briefly. And what I've done is I've underlined some of the key words. And as you look at some of these key words, what you're going to find is you're going to find David mentioning, meditating on, giving thanks for some things that God does that cannot be stopped, that cannot be changed, that cannot be undone, but that God will do and has done. And that David is confident in these things. And even when he's between a rock and a hard place, he can win those spiritual battles because he knows how to exercise gratitude as he takes refuge in these unchanging things. Look at Psalm 59, starting in verse 8. But you, O Lord, laugh at them. You hold all the nations in derision. O my strength, I will watch for you, O God, are my fortress. I've underlined these key words. You are my fortress. My God, in his steadfast love, will meet me. God will let me look in triumph on my enemies. You skip down to verse 16. David says, but I will sing of your strength. I will sing aloud of your steadfast love in the morning. For you have been to me a fortress and a refuge in the day of my distress. Oh, my strength. He calls God his strength again. He says, I will sing praises to you, for you, O God, are my fortress, the God who shows me steadfast love. And he repeats himself a few times. Now, what I've done is I've just kind of listed these keywords here. He says fortress and refuge. He's showing that God's our place of protection, that we can take a retreat into him and who he is. He uses steadfast love a couple of times because he understands, as we do, that we are the object of God's love. That all of his actions and power are exerted on our behalf. He uses the word triumph because he knows, as we do, as what happened with Jesus at the resurrection, that God vindicates us. He vindicates his people. Nobody can change these things. These are the things that we know are always going to be. They're unchangeable. They're immutable. He uses the word strength because God has made our salvation secure. There's no one stronger than him. There's no one that can overcome him. There may be some passages that are coming to your mind right now, and that's good, that I'm not going to get to because I'm kind of holding on to some of these things for possibly some later characters I'm going to look at. But I'm just going to stick to what David says for now. In another instance, in 1 Samuel 21, King Saul is continuing to pursue David, and David actually flees to one of the 5 Philistine cities of Gath, and they apprehend him there. The Philistines apprehend David because he's running from Saul. This is in 1 Samuel 21, 10 through 15. And when he gets there, in order for them to, I don't know if you want to call this psychological warfare, he starts acting like a crazy person. And he starts scratching the walls, and it says that spittle is running down his beard, and he's just acting like a crazy person to try to keep them from doing anything to him. But during this event, he writes Psalm 56. Now, kind of moving back, it's interesting, chronologically through 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, they're in reverse in the Psalms. Now we're going backwards to Psalm 56. Now, the heading for Psalm 56 is this: a mention of David when the Philistines captured him at Gath. Let's look at this whole psalm. It's only 13 verses, and they're short. Psalm 56, starting verse 1. Be gracious to me, O God, for a man tramples on me. All day long an attacker oppresses me. And when I read these, I think, David's just one of us, isn't he? And I don't know if I mentioned this before, but something I wanted to mention is this. And I thought maybe you would see it as we go through even more. The benefit of the Psalms, there's 150 Psalms, and some of them are like this. Some of them are people in distress calling out to God. Sometimes they're thanking Him for being victorious. Sometimes they're in a sticky situation and they're calling for God to do what they know God will do. And as we look through these, I want you to know that the Psalms are, they're really a couple of things to us. They can aid us in a couple of things. In fact, the last one that I'm going to look at is a song that you might recognize. But these are essentially songs or prayers. Lots of songs are prayers. And the reason that the Psalms are so important and so significant, and why I want you to make note of the ones that we're looking at today, and these are not the only ones, but the reason that these are so important is this. If you're having a difficult time, if you're struggling with something, if you're having anxiety, if you're being compressed on all sides by different things in your life, if you're experiencing some sort of difficulty and you're having trouble dealing with it, God has given us by inspiration these Psalms that if we do what we're doing this morning, if we will go to them, read through them, meditate on what is being said, that we through these Psalms will exercise this spiritual discipline of gratitude, this defensive tactic against the spiritual war against us. Take advantage of the Psalms in helping to guide our minds to spiritually healthy things, to spiritually healthy places. Because it is very easy to walk out into the world or back into your family or back to your job and for your mind to be taken into an unhealthy place spiritually. So let's continue. Verse 2. He says, "My enemies trample on me all day long, for many attack me proudly. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you." We can trust God. Why? Because He's proven Himself. He's not going to let us down. Verse 4, "In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me?" This type of wording may bring to your mind some other faithful people in the Bible. Verse 5, "All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They stir up strife. They lurk. They watch my steps as they have waited for my life. For their crime will they escape? In wrath cast down the peoples, O God." The wrath of God is unchanging for His people. Verse 8, "You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle." God is aware of every instance of difficulty you experience. Are they not in your book? "Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God, whose word I praise. In the Lord, whose word I praise." That's the foundation. You know, Romans 10, when you think of the idea of our faith being based on God's word, it's true. It's the foundation. It's what Jesus says at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. If you'll build your life on the words that I'm telling you. What is David saying? He's saying, I'm putting my trust, I'm building my life on the foundation of your words. Whose word I praise. In the Lord, whose word I praise. Verse 11, "In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render thank offerings to you. For you have delivered my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. And let's look at these key words. He uses the word trust because God has always proven himself to be faithful. The word wrath, again, because God vindicates us. And you'll see some recurring themes here. He counts our difficulties. And it's poetry. It's a beautiful poetic way of saying it, that God has collected every tear that you have ever shed in a bottle, and he knows how many. He knows how many tears you've shed. Do we think of God in that way? Do we understand who he is? And that he's not ever going to change from being exactly like that? What a beautiful way of describing how much he cares about us. You think you've ever been alone in your suffering or in your grief or in your difficulty? You're wrong. He knows every instance of difficulty. He knows every pain. He says, God is for me. I'm the object of his love. God's primary interest is my well-being, and it will never be anything different than that. And he uses the term God's word. We can take refuge in God's word because it doesn't change. It's one of the unchanging things. It's one of the other themes that we'll see in some other places. He uses the word delivered because God saves us. And I hesitate to jump to some verses that you're thinking of, but I hope that this is planting some seeds of interest in looking at some other places where these same themes are. And he uses the term walk before God in light of life. That is God who makes us upright and preserves us to continue to walk. It isn't by my own strength. Moving as quickly as I can here. Going to another instance. In 1 Samuel 23, verse 15 through 20, King Saul is continuing to pursue David. And these people called the Ziphites, they are conspiring with Saul. And they say, hey, we know where David is hiding out. And so Saul says, oh, okay, so give me some good intelligence and information about where he is, and I'll go get him. Well, somehow or another, David finds out about this, and he goes to another location. But at that instance, during that occasion, David writes Psalm 54. The heading or title of Psalm 54 is a contemplation of David when the Ziphites went and said to Saul, is David not hiding with us? Oh, he's over here. David's over here. He's fleeing for his life. Psalm 54, starting in verse 1. Oh God, save me by your name. Did he have any doubt about that? Do we have any doubt about that? We know that's secure, right? Save me by your name and vindicate me by your might. Oh God, hear my prayer. Give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers have risen against me. Ruthless men seek my life. They do not set God before themselves. We find the term here, Selah. S-E-L-A-H, which it's debated what this actually means, but it's essentially a pause in the poetry. It's a time of reflection or a time of letting what has just been said sink in. Let's give what we just said a moment. There are some people that don't set God before them. Verse 4, behold, God is my helper. Have you heard that in the New Testament? He's my helper. The Lord is the upholder of my life. What a beautiful way of thinking. Do you uphold your own life? No. God's doing that. He will return the evil to my enemies. In your faithfulness, put an end to them. With a free will offering, I will sacrifice to you. I will give thanks to your name. O Lord, for it is good. For he has delivered me from every trouble, and my eye has looked in triumph on my enemies. And so look at the words he uses. The word save or delivered. God brings salvation, and there isn't any stopping that. When we are his people, He saves us because God saves his people. Because God is who he is. When we understand who God is and the unchanging nature of God, then all of this makes sense. It removes the doubt of whether or not these things are unchanging. Again, we have the idea of being vindicated, or the term triumph. God, you've been treated in an unjust way. God brings justice. God will always make every wrong in your life, he will one day make right. He brings justice to your life. He's the helper, the upholder. God is the one who's sustaining me. He is the one who is strengthening me. And we skip ahead to 2 Samuel. In 2 Samuel, let's just say there's some family drama in David's household, and Absalom is set against him. In 2 Samuel 15, a messenger comes to David in verse 13 and says, "The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom. Their allegiance is to him now." And so now David and those who are with him, they're afraid that Absalom and those men, they're going to come kill him. And in this situation, David writes Psalm 3. Psalm 3. The title of Psalm 3 is a Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. If you know the story, you know that it's tragic. But look at what we find in Psalm 3. It's only 8 verses long. "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Selah. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. Selah. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. For you strike all my enemies on the cheek, you break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessings be on your people. Selah." He uses the word shield. That's the idea of exercising the defensive tactic of gratitude is taking retreat behind what God has given to protect us. As a refuge, as a shield. We find what similar terminology in Ephesians 6, that we may withstand against the fiery darts of the devil, or the wiles of the devil. He is our shield. He's our protection. And this word he uses of glory, he says, my glory, that God is his glory. What does that mean? I got to thinking about this, and we can glorify ourselves, we can recognize the glory of God, but the idea that it isn't us that glorifies God that he's talking about, it's that God brings glory to us, which is an interesting thought, but really it's this question. What is it that's great about my life? What is it that's really great about the life of a Christian? It's God. It's God that makes my life good. When I think of the idea of what is the glory of my life, what is the thing that illuminates my life, what is the thing that sanctifies my life, what is the thing that makes my life good? It's God. He is my glory. And he uses the term the lifter of my head, and that he sustains me, because it's God who helps us, strengthens us, helps us to walk upright, helps us to persevere. And again, the word salvation. God, it is God that we put our confidence in to make it through difficult times. The last instance I want to look at is in 2 Samuel 22. And if you turn to 2 Samuel 22, what you'll find is that it's actually Psalm 18. If you go to 2 Samuel 22, and then you open your Bible to Psalm 18, you'll find they're identical. And the heading of this, or what it says there even in 2 Samuel 22, the heading is this: a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. Now, of course, Saul had died much earlier than this, but this is long. I'm not going to read all of this. Just the first 3 verses. This is after the difficulty has passed, after God has shown himself to be powerful, to vindicate him, to bring salvation, to pour out his blessings on him. What happens to us when we come through the darkness and we begin to see the light a little bit? It's important for us to do what David does. When he sees the light at the end of the tunnel and it's not a train, what does he say? How does he speak? It's in very similar ways. This is what he says. Psalm 18, starting in verse 1. He says, I love you, O Lord, my strength. Do we talk that way in our prayers to God? Or do we talk enough like that? Do we really acknowledge what has happened? I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation. The horn is the idea of the strength, the power of my salvation, my stronghold. All these terms are kind of similar, aren't they? I have the English Standard Version here, so it's not exactly like the song that you know. He says, I call upon the Lord who's worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. You see, that's the context of the song. I will call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, so will I be saved from my enemies. You see, when we exercise gratitude is what he's saying. We exercise gratitude in what? When we are under attack, when our enemy has been defeated. We do the same thing with both. We are acknowledging what? What are the terms that he uses? That God is our strength. That we did not succeed by our own strength. Only by the Lord's strength did we succeed. He uses the term rock. That God is our immovable foundation. He's the immovable foundation of your life. He uses the terms fortress, refuge, shield, stronghold. That's what happens. See, what am I without God? I'm defenseless. I can't win the fight. I can't win the battle. But God says, no, look, here's a castle and a big cinder block wall and a shield. Here's a cave. I have a nice little place for you right here. You'll be safe. My heart mourns for people who do not have that. People who do not have God do not have a safe place to take refuge. They are without hope. When they are in their dark times, when the world is hitting them from all sides, they don't have that. They don't have that hope. David did, and he took refuge in it. And now that he's come out the other side, he's acknowledged. He says, well, I wasn't the one who was able to do this. I was hiding behind God. God was taking the force of this. It was his strength. It was his power. It was his protection that brought me through this. That brought me salvation. That saved me, his other words, that we find throughout. He talks about the strength of God, the refuge of God, the steadfastness of God, the love of God, the salvation of God. It's only God. who can save. It's only God that can give this type of hope. And that's all I wanted to cover with David. There were some others I wanted to throw in there. But this is enough for now. What we'll find as we continue through some of these case studies are the same things, because it is the same God who stays exactly the same. And so that really begs the question, are you taking advantage of what God offers? He loves you. He exercises His power on your behalf. His well-being, your well-being, is His primary interest. He wants to protect you. He wants to uphold you. He wants to save you and help you persevere because He cares about you. And without Him, you have no hope. And I encourage you, if you haven't come to God through Christ, then you stand outside of the safe place of God's protection. You stand in the place of no hope, of no salvation. You're standing outside of what God has purposed Himself in His love and His power to bless you with. Jesus calls us to come to Him. If you want to become a Christian today, Jesus says, "He who believes in me and is baptized shall be saved." In other words, those who enter into the protection of Christ, those who are clothed with Christ, those who enter into the salvation of Christ, those who let Jesus fight the fight for them, those who instead of facing their own death, let Jesus face death for them. These are the unchanging realities of the Christian life, the things we can take refuge in, the things that we need to be reminded of and remind each other of so that we can win these spiritual fights, these spiritual battles in these difficult times. We can help you in any way this morning, lift you up in prayer. If you want to study about becoming a Christian, we'd love to do that. Randy's going to lead us in a song of encouragement. And this is a particular good time with all your family here that loves you to surround you and help you if you need it. If you have a need, come as we stand and sing this song of encouragement.